So design patterns and solid are concepts we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But very recently, I've been reading and watching some materials that go against them. There's a video I watched that blatantly blames solid for why software is bad nowadays. And I want to dig into that perspective because
Mm-hmm.
I do think there is something there.
Okay.
One of them is Casey Moritori, I believe. His channel is called Molly Rocket. He's a game developer and he's like extremely smart.
Okay.
Has a big following. So where does bad code come from? This video I was talking about. He also has a separate one that I liked called Simple Code High Performance. I really like this video. It's a 3-hour lecture,
Okay.
but I really like that. But in has several things in it that I liked. But one of them is a point where he says, basically he says code reuse is bad, more or less. This concept of code reuse being a bad thing, uh, I want to say I haven't really heard it before, but recently I have heard it like 3 or 4 times from different people. Yeah, so this part where he says, um, that's a lot of code. The meta reason, so he's talking about a piece of code that is slow, and he rewrote it to be fast, like a lot faster, like
Okay.
like more than 10 times faster, maybe
Okay.
30 times faster, or even
Okay.
more.
Uh-huh.
And he said, why is the code slow? The meta reason why code is slow is because people write way too much code. They do this in two ways. Number one is they reuse a lot of code. Reusing code is something that people have been taught to do, and there are reasons why you may want to reuse code, but the problem with it is when you reuse code, you usually don't think about all the stuff that code is doing that you didn't actually need it to do. Basically, he's saying like reusing code that's doing more than
Mm.
what you need for that use case, that for that situation that you
Mm-hmm.
have. um
Makes
and
sense. Yeah, because when you use a library, like say you use a complex library and the library is trying to resolve all the issues for everybody because it's a library, but you only resolve one
yeah,
issue.
the library has to check for error conditions, right?
Yeah.
That they're like, oh, is your input even correct, or
Yeah.
like, oh, maybe the library is in, you put the library in a different mode, or there's like if it's a CSS, like you're in the flex mode, or you're in grid mode, or you're
Mm-hmm.
in the normal CSS mode, and depends on which mode it is, you can do
Uh-huh.
this or you can't do this.
Uh-huh.
um, and all those if statements are not things you would need if all you ever have is flex mode, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
um,
That
um,
is true.
so that's what he's saying, like we're doing code reuse too much and it has these drawbacks. Yeah, I mean, um I think, yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with what he's saying, that maybe we reuse code too much.
And
uh,
another case that is not that is different from like performance is you remember I went to the architecture like conference at some point with Jason,
mm-hmm.
New York, and that conference is all about like microservice and stuff like that. So basically, the idea is microservice at the end is all the service, they don't depend on each other. They don't have like shared components, so they're like completely independent. So that's the first time I hear like, oh, you should not reuse code, you should just copy the
Right.
code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
just
yes,
because of the independency.
yeah, I remember that because the dependency, like I'm depending on a piece of code that does something for me,
Yeah.
but now I have to do something for it. So two more sources that I want to put here. So one is, so I was really digging into this fourth programming language, which again we will I'll put out more compilers challenges,
Okay.
and it will cover this language because I am I'm really in love with this language. The original inventor of Forth, his name is Chuck Moore or Charles Moore, and there's a whole story about him. But it talks about his 3 principles that he uses for coding.
Okay.
Now, first of all, Forth was a personal response to his frustration with existing software tools, which he viewed as a sort of Tower of Babel. And the word Babel, I think he used, interestingly, that's actually a tool we use in the JavaScript community. But I think the word Babel he uses to mean there's a lot of languages and you have to translate like to and from, a lot of levels of translation. So and Babel is okay.
Yeah.
According to the story, a united human race in generations following the Great Flood, speaking a single language and migrating eastward, comes to the okay. Okay, I have to read this, but maybe not right now. But I guess yeah, the frustration is there's a lot of languages, like the compiler is written in a different language from the language that's actually you're using to write your application, and then the compiler has to translate your language into the assembly language.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of these layers of translation going on, and I want to teach people compilers, but it's difficult precisely because there's all these languages that they're going to have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And learning one language is difficult enough, right? You have to learn several languages. Above all, his guiding principle, which he calls the basic principle, is keep it simple. Okay. That makes sense.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
So the number of capability you add to a program increases. The complexity of the program increases exponentially. It can easily get out of hand. You can avoid this if you apply the basic principle. I would say in practice, it just takes more effort to always come up with the simple solution. So if you're always rushing software out the door, you're not going to take that extra effort and time to do it the way that's the simplest. And that's what I was sort of talking about earlier when I said, I just go out for a walk and I come back with some ideas about how to make it simpler, right? But that requires more patience and time.
Well, I guess the other thing is the requirement just become more and more complicated. If you think about like the software people had like say 30 years ago, it's not that complicated. Like say the front end is just rendering some text and then you can render the text and be done with it. But now it just gets crazy. Like you need all this kind of stuff like interactions, all this formatting, all this CSS, everything just gets more and more complicated.
But are all those layers necessary to solve the problem, or are they just complications that were put there accidentally? Are they accidental complexity, or are they inherent complexities? I think that's debatable.
Okay.
Like we don't have to use CSS to lay out our stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's true.
If it's been said that like CSS is not necessarily the greatest. um, well, I'm not going to get into that, but like if you could redesign CSS from scratch, or don't even think about CSS, it's not. It doesn't have to look anything like CSS at all. You're going to redesign a way to lay out your things. How would you do it? And could you come up with a simpler scheme than that? You probably can. Okay, his second principle is do not speculate. Yeah, I say that as well. But that's the you ain't gonna need it principle of TDD. Like don't build anything that you might not need. And then his third principle is do it yourself. He's basically going against the idea of code reuse in a way. He tends to like rewrite his own stuff all the time. Like before you can write your own subroutines, you have to know how. This means to be practical that you have written it before, which makes it difficult to get started. But give it a try. After writing the same subroutine a dozen times on as many computers and languages, you'll be pretty good at it. Yeah, so he keeps rewriting the same stuff over and over again, but each time with a variation. And it's obvious that you would get really good at it if you kept doing that for years. I think that's interesting. And then another one is this interview with Donald Knuth. Sorry. And he's the author of this very famous series called The Art of Computer Programming. So Andrew asks Donald Knuth, on your website you mentioned that the blah blah blah. In the segment 93 called Advice to Young People, you advise that people shouldn't do something simply because it's trendy. As we all know too well, software development is as subject to fads as any other discipline. Can you give some examples that are currently in vogue, which developers shouldn't adopt simply because they are currently popular or because that's the way they're currently done, blah, blah, blah. And he says, that question is almost contradictory because I'm basically advising young people to listen to themselves rather than to others. And I'm one of those others. So if you listen to me, then you wouldn't be listening to yourself. But here later on, he says, I must also confess to a strong bias against the fashion for reusable code. To me, re-editable code is much, much better than an untouchable black box or toolkit. I could go on and on about this. If you're totally convinced that reusable code is wonderful, I probably won't be able to sway you anyway, but you'll never convince me that reusable code isn't mostly a menace.
Okay.
Mostly a menace. He's saying reusable code is mostly a menace. That's a very strong words. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Like we've all been taught like reusable code is good, something you should strive for, and I wrote like a story about the Three Little Pigs story about it.
Right.
But we have these very smart and experienced individuals that really go against the idea of reusable code. So I think there's something there.
Well, I would say if I have unlimited time and no like deadlines of like pushing new software or like, oh, you have to deliver this functionality by this time. If that is not a thing, I agree with him. I won't like just pull like other people's library and do it. Probably will try to do it myself, and because I will learn it if I do it myself, and I can edit if I need to, and I can add more stuff. But I think most of the times I have to use other people's thing is just because I don't have enough time to reinvent the wheel in the work setting. I think that's what to me is an issue.
Like you feel like you have to because there are these things that are available out there that you can use. And I think there's also this peer pressure of your coworkers know that there are these things that you can use. Why wouldn't you use them? That kind of thing. Or there are just these very popular libraries that maybe the company really trusts.
Yeah.
So to go against the grain like that
Mm-hmm.
might not be a popular choice to make. I think those things are there. I think there might be situations where it would actually not every situation obviously, but there can be situations where it would actually be more efficient to just do that thing yourself instead of use a library that's available, because maybe
Yeah.
the library is not that good and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't match your needs perfectly.
Yeah, I have encountered that situation before as well. So, which is, oh, there is actually a library that does the thing, but actually, the thing that I created is simpler, and because we created in-house, so you can like add functionality if you want to, or you can change the syntax, change the interface if you need to. But the library, you just can't do it. So at the end, we go with the in-house solution. But it's case by case. I don't
Yeah.
think it's just like always this or that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.